A luxurious train, a brutal murder, and a killer hiding in plain sight. But here's the real question: how do you escape when the murderer is sitting right next to you? The wind howled mercilessly, rattling the windows of the Orient Express as it carved a path through the snowy Balkan wilderness. Flurries of ice clung to the glass, blurring the stark expanse of white outside. Inside, however, the world was warm, opulent, and alive. Golden chandeliers cast a soft glow over the plush velvet seats and intricately carved mahogany walls. Laughter mingled with the soft clinking of champagne glasses as well-dressed passengers savored fine meals served by attentive stewards. The scent of fresh cigars and expensive perfume lingered in the air. This was no ordinary journey. It was a sanctuary of luxury, untouched by the harshness of the world beyond. Seated near a window, Hercule Poirot, his signature mustache immaculately groomed, observed the scene with practiced calm. His sharp eyes missed nothing, cataloging every detail with the precision of a man accustomed to untangling the complexities of human nature. Though he had been looking forward to a rare moment of peace, something in the air made his senses prickle. Further down the carriage, Samuel Ratchett, a nervous man with darting eyes and a perpetual sheen of sweat on his forehead, sipped from a glass of brandy. His fingers trembled slightly as he fiddled with a gold pocket watch. Despite the luxurious surroundings, Ratchett's unease was palpable, as though he were a man hunted by invisible shadows. The train swayed gently, its rhythmic chugging lulling most passengers into a state of contentment. But Poirot noticed Ratchett, glancing over his shoulder every few minutes, eyes wide with a fear he tried to mask. The businessman's paranoia hung in the air like a storm cloud, ready to burst. Then it happened. A piercing scream shattered the night, slicing through the jovial atmosphere like a blade. Conversations halted mid-sentence, glasses froze halfway to lips, and a collective hush swept through the train. Poirot was already on his feet, his instincts sharp as ever. Stewards rushed toward the source of the commotion, Ratchett's private compartment. The door was locked from the inside. Knocking yielded no response. "Break it down," Poirot commanded firmly, his voice cutting through the chaos. The wood splintered with a crash. Gasps filled the corridor as passengers craned their necks to see inside. Ratchett lay sprawled across the velvet cushions, his face contorted in a grimace of terror. Blood soaked the front of his silk robe, seeping into the cushions beneath him. The metallic tang of it hung heavy in the air. Poirot's gaze swept the room, noting every detail with methodical precision: the overturned chair, the shattered glass on the floor, and the strangest sight of all, Ratchett's hand tightly clutching a charred fragment of paper, its edges still smoldering. The murder was brutal. 12 stab wounds, some deep and forceful, others shallow and hesitant. But the most unsettling detail: the door had been locked from the inside. Cliffhanger ending. Poirot's expression hardened as he took in the scene. The luxurious train, once a haven of comfort, had become a claustrophobic prison. Snow continued to fall relentlessly outside, sealing them in. He straightened, his voice steady but grim. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced solemnly, "there is no escape. The murderer is still on this train." The passengers gasped, fear flashing in their eyes. Whispers rippled through the crowd as the weight of his words sank in. But Poirot's thoughts were already racing, piecing together fragments of a puzzle that had only just begun to reveal itself. Who among these refined travelers harbored a dark secret? Who had the will to plunge a blade into another's flesh 12 times? The storm raged on outside, but the true tempest had just begun within the gilded walls of the Orient Express. Harbored a dark secret. Who had the will to plunge a blade into another's flesh 12 times? The storm raged on outside, but the true tempest had just begun within the gilded walls of the Orient Express. The investigation. The night was thick with tension. The once elegant atmosphere of the Orient Express had turned suffocating, heavy with whispers and fearful glances. Outside, snow battered against the windows, sealing them off from the rest of the world. Inside, death loomed like an uninvited guest. Poirot stood in Samuel Ratchett's dimly lit compartment, his sharp eyes scanning every inch of the crime scene. Ratchett's body lay grotesquely slumped over the crimson-stained cushions. His face was twisted in a final, frozen grimace man who had stared into the eyes of his killer. 12 stab wounds marred his torso, scattered haphazardly across his silk robe. Poirot knelt closer, inspecting the injuries with a meticulous eye. Some wounds were deep, deliberate, fueled by rage. Others were hesitant, shallow, as if delivered by a trembling hand. It was an odd combination, two distinct emotional states captured in brutal symmetry. Why? Poirot's brow furrowed. There was no logic to this madness. Mon Dieu, he murmured softly, his voice taut with controlled emotion. Such savagery, yet such restraint. A burned fragment of paper caught his attention near Ratchett's limp hand. Its edges were charred, but faint traces of ink remained visible. Poirot carefully retrieved the scrap, holding it up to the flickering light. The letters AZ Arm teased at a story left incomplete. Ah, a name perhaps, Poirot whispered to himself. Daisy Armstrong. His memory flickered, recalling a notorious tragedy from years past. But before he could dwell on it, another detail demanded his attention. On the plush carpet, near the edge of the compartment, lay a delicate handkerchief, embroidered with an elegant H. The stitching was fine, regal, even belonging to someone of refinement. Poirot's gaze lingered on it, wondering who had dropped such a personal item at the scene of a brutal murder. Then there was the broken pocket watch, its glass cracked, and its hands frozen at precisely 1:15 a.m. A clue, no doubt, marking the exact time the killer struck. The train creaked ominously, swaying against the relentless storm outside. Poirot stood, his expression grave. There was no escape. Snow had trapped them in this wilderness, isolating them from civilization. The murderer was still among them. The door creaked open, and the conductor hesitated on the threshold, his face pale. Monsieur Poirot, what do we do now? Poirot's voice was low but commanding, cutting through the conductor's fear. We find the truth, he said firmly. The murderer is still on this train. His declaration sent a ripple of unease through the gathered passengers, peering from the corridor. Eyes darted nervously, suspicion thick in the air. Poirot stepped back into the corridor, his gaze sweeping over each face. Wealth, class, and sophistication masked their expressions, but beneath the polished facades, secrets lurked. He knew it. He felt it. And he would uncover them all. Cliffhanger ending. As the train rattled beneath their feet, Poirot turned to the passengers. No one leaves, no one speaks to anyone but me, he commanded. Until I know the truth, we are all prisoners of this storm, and this crime. A hush fell over the group, but Poirot's thoughts churned. His instincts whispered that this case was far more twisted than it appeared. The storm outside showed no signs of relenting, and neither did the storm brewing inside the Orient Express. One of these refined, polished individuals was a killer, and Poirot was determined to find out who. The passengers, and their secrets. Twists start. The tension aboard the Orient Express thickened, a tangible weight in the air. The passengers had all retreated into their compartments, each of them cloaked in their own private griefs, secrets, and unresolved histories. Hercule Poirot had a suspicion that beneath the surfaces of their carefully cultivated personas, a world of complexities lay hidden. One by one, he would peel away the layers. Mary Debenham, the composed governess, was his first target. She had always carried herself with an icy demeanor, cold, distant, and aloof. To the casual observer, she was simply a woman of discipline, unruffled by the chaos around her. But Poirot, as always, was more than just an observer. He stood across from her in the elegant parlor car, watching her hands as she carefully folded a letter, her movements deliberate, almost mechanical. Her face betrayed little emotion, but Poirot saw the way her eyes flickered for a split second, barely noticeable, but there nonetheless. Madame Debenham, Poirot began softly, his voice smooth like velvet, but carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken questions. Tell me, did you know the victim, Mr. Ratchett? Her lips curled into a tight smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. I met him once or twice, Monsieur Poirot, but I don't see how it is relevant. Poirot nodded slowly. Indeed, perhaps it is not. But what of your past, madame? The eyes do not lie, you know. They reveal more than the tongue dares to speak. Her breath caught. Poirot saw it. He had struck a nerve. She quickly composed herself, but he knew something was amiss. Next, he turned to Colonel Arbuthnot, who had been seated nearby, watching the exchange. The British officer's jaw was set with an unyielding determination, as if nothing could shake his composure. His protective gaze never wavered from Mary. "Colonel," Poirot said, his voice unwavering, "you are fiercely protective of Miss Debenham. Tell me, why is that? What binds you two?" The colonel's eyes darkened, a shadow of something unspoken passing over his face. He didn't answer immediately. His hand tightened around the glass of whiskey he was holding, but he didn't speak. Poirot leaned in slightly, his gaze piercing. "There is a history between you, something you would rather forget. But remember, monsieur, secrets always come to light." At that moment, the air felt colder, the room more stifling. Poirot's attention shifted to Princess Dragomirov, who sat by the window, her regal figure illuminated by the faint light from the flickering chandelier. She appeared unshaken, her aristocratic exterior as solid as ever, but Poirot knew that beneath the polished surface, something darker was at play. "Your Highness," he began, his voice warm but firm, "you seem to carry the weight of 1,000 secrets with you. Perhaps you could share one. There is guilt in your eyes, years of it, I suspect." The princess's face twitched imperceptibly, a flicker of guilt, and then a swift, deliberate mask fell over her features. "Monsieur Poirot, you are mistaken," she said, her voice unwavering. "I am an old woman. I have nothing to hide." Poirot didn't press her further, but he knew she was lying. The princess knew more than she was willing to admit, could feel it. And then there was Hildegard Schmidt, the princess's loyal maid, standing quietly in the corner of the room. She was more than just a servant. Her eyes had followed every movement, every interaction, and Poirot could see the glimmer of something deeper in theme, a knowing, perhaps even a warning. "You, Mademoiselle Schmidt," Poirot said, turning toward her with a polite nod, "have seen more than anyone realizes. I believe you know far more than you let on." Her lips twitched, but she remained silent. She knew it was only a matter of time before Poirot would extract the truth from her. Next came Antonio Foscarelli, the boisterous Italian salesman, his presence so loud and unmissable that it was hard to take him seriously at first. He was quick with his words, a smile always playing on his lips, but there was an underlying bitterness in his tone, a grudge, one that could easily be hidden beneath the surface. "Signor Foscarelli," Poirot said, his voice calm but carrying a hint of authority. "I know you well, the bravado, the charm, but there's something beneath it, something you hide." The salesman's face faltered for just a moment, a flash of vulnerability before he quickly regained his composure. "I have nothing to hide, Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice too loud, too eager. "I am a simple man doing my work, a little business, a little fun." Poirot didn't believe him. He knew Foscarelli's words were a facade, a mask that covered up something far darker. "Doing my work, a little business, a little fun." Poirot didn't believe him. He knew Foscarelli's words were a facade, a mask that covered up something far darker. And finally, the Count and Countess Andreniotwo people, whose mystery was as thick as the night surrounding them. They seemed to glide through the train, moving as one, never revealing more than what was necessary. Their silence was deafening. Poirot sat down across from them in their compartment, his eyes narrowing. "Ah, the lovers who say nothing. You know the art of evasion, but not enough to escape my questions." The Countess's lips trembled, and the Count stiffened. They both avoided his gaze, their shared secret hanging in the air between them like an unspoken threat. Poirot's eyes swept over the passengers in the room, each one, a piece in a puzzle that was growing more intricate by the minute. Everyone had something to hide. Everyone had a motive. The web of lies was beginning to weave itself tighter, and Poirot could feel the walls closing in on the truth. Cliffhanger ending. Poirot rose from his chair, his voice steady and resolute. "I will return for each of you," he declared. Every one of you will face the truth. Your secrets cannot stay hidden forever." As he left the room, the train seemed to shudder in response, as if even it were nervous about what would unfold next. The storm outside howled louder, drowning out the whispers within. Each passenger knew their turn was coming, and with each step Poirot took, they felt the weight of their secrets closing in. The game had only just begun. Midpoint twist. The silence in the train was suffocating, as Poirot paced through the narrow corridors, his mind racing through the twists and turns of the investigation. With each passing minute, the truth became more elusive, more tangled in the web of lies and deceit spun by the passengers of the Orient Express. The storm raged on outside, but it was the storm inside his mind that was consuming him. Poirot paused before a small, private compartment, the one he had been avoiding for some time. He took a deep breath before stepping inside. It was here, in this room, that the key to the mystery had revealed itself. He had discovered something small, something seemingly insignificant. A faded newspaper clipping tucked between the pages of a book in Samuel Ratchett's compartment. It was a headline about the kidnapping and murder of the child of a wealthy American couple, a tragedy that had rocked the world years ago. The child, Daisy Armstrong, had been snatched from her home, and despite extensive investigation, the case had gone unsolved. Until now. Poirot's heart skipped a beat as he examined the image of a man in the clipping. Samuel Ratchett, the same man who had been found dead aboard the train. The name Christie stood out in bold letters beneath the photo, and Poirot felt a chill crawl up his spine. Samuel Ratchett, the man who had posed as a nervous businessman, was none other than the notorious criminal, Christie, the very man responsible for the horrific murder of Daisy Armstrong. As the truth sank in, Poirot's mind raced back through the faces of the passengers. Every one of them had a connection to the Armstrong tragedy. Mary Debenham, the governess, had been Daisy's nursemaid. Colonel Arbuthnot had served in the military alongside the Armstrong family's security team. Princess Dragomirov, despite her aristocratic exterior, had once been close friends with Daisy's mother. Antonio Foscarelli, the salesman, had worked as a chauffeur for the Armstrong family. The Count and Countess Andreniu had been involved in the legal battle over the case. Even Hildegard Schmidt, the princess's maid, had been a silent witness to the suffering of the Armstrongs. The truth was clear: each of these passengers had been personally affected by the death of Daisy Armstrong. And they all shared one thing in common: the desire for revenge against the man who had stolen that innocent life. Poirot felt a knot tighten in his chest as he processed the implications of this revelation. He had thought this was a murder case, a simple crime that needed to be solved. But now it was something much darker. The passengers weren't just witnesses to a crime, they were accomplices. They had all conspired together to seek justice, or perhaps to exact their own form of vengeance, for a crime that had shattered their lives. Poirot stood still, his mind in turmoil. Was this justice, or was it murder? As a detective, Poirot had always prided himself on his unwavering belief in the law. But now, as he looked at the faces of the people on the train, he couldn't help but question everything he had believed in. These were not the cold, calculating criminals he had encountered before. These were people who had suffered, people who had been robbed of their hope, their peace. They had lost everything to Christie's evil, and now they had taken matters into their own hands. Poirot's thoughts turned to the one person who hadn't yet been fully examined. The victim himself. Samuel Ratchett, or Christie, had been a man consumed by his own guilt, his own demons. But did he deserve to die? Did anyone have the right to decide whether his life should be taken, whether he should pay for his sins? Was the act of murder ever justifiable, even in the face of such unbearable loss? Poirot couldn't answer these questions, not yet. The investigation had reached a crossroads, and the path forward was unclear. But one thing was certain: he had a moral dilemma on his hands. The law was black and white, but this truth was 1,000 shades of gray. As Poirot returned to the passenger's compartment, the weight of the revelation hung heavily in the air. Each of the suspects, now more than ever, seemed like a puzzle piece, each one a reflection of the other, bound together by shared grief and a desire for retribution. But who had struck the final blow? And was it truly murder if the victim was a monster who had ruined so many lives? Cliffhanger ending. Poirot turned to face them all, his voice steady but tinged with the gravity of his realization. "Messieurs, mesdames," he said, "I have uncovered a most disturbing truth. Samuel Ratchett was not who he claimed to be. He was Cassetti, the man responsible for the death of little Daisy Armstrong." The faces in the room remained still, some with shock, others with guilt flashing across their eyes. Poirot's words hung in the air like a heavy fog. "But now, I must ask," Poirot continued, his gaze sweeping over each passenger, "did you kill him out of justice, or did you murder him to satisfy your own vengeance?" The silence that followed was deafening. No one dared speak, no one dared look him in the eye. Each person in that room was haunted by their own secrets, by their own choices, and by the moral labyrinth they were trapped within. Poirot paused, his eyes sharp and calculating. "The truth is closer than you think, but before I can solve this puzzle, I must confront one last question." He stopped himself, letting the words hang in the air. Then, with a slow, deliberate turn, he left the room, his steps echoing through the darkened corridor. Outside, the storm had reached a deafening crescendo, the wind howling like a beast unleashed. The Orient Express was trapped, its passengers trapped, and the truth, no matter how twisted, was still just out of reach. The game, Poirot knew, was far from over. The game, Poirot knew, was far from over. The tension builds. The night seemed endless aboard the Orient Express. The rhythmic clatter of the train's wheels against the tracks was now nothing more than a backdrop to the mounting tension that hung in the air. Poirot, ever the master of human nature, had begun his most difficult task, confronting the passengers one by one. It was no longer about finding the killer, it was about breaking down the emotional walls of each suspect, exposing the raw wounds beneath their facades. Each of them was bound by the same thread, a thread of shared grief, guilt, and the devastating consequences of a single murder. And now, as Poirot sat across from them in their lavish compartments, he saw something in their eyes that chilled him to the core, a desperation to either confess or hide, an urgency to clear their conscience or bury their sins forever. First, Mary Debenham. Her composed demeanor had always been her shield, but as Poirot dug deeper, her calm exterior began to crack. It was in the way her eyes momentarily flickered with pain when he asked about Daisy Armstrong. The question had hit too close to home, and for the first time, Poirot saw something more than just a governess, saw a woman whose heart had been shattered by a tragedy she couldn't undo. Mary's past was a jagged piece of brokenness, an affair that had been discovered too late, a betrayal too deep to forgive. The anguish in her voice when she spoke of Daisy was palpable, but it wasn't just grief, it was the guilt of someone who had known the truth and had done nothing to stop it. It was this silence, Poirot realized, that had been a source of torment for her. She had been part of a family that could not protect its own, and now she was part of something much darker. But was her involvement in the murder driven by justice, or was it revenge? Colonel Arbuthnot's turn was next. A man who had served in countless battles, who wore his stoicism like a badge of honor. Yet when Poirot asked him about Daisy's kidnapping, there was a subtle shift in his posture. His protective instinct toward Mary Debenham was undeniable, but Poirot was sharp enough to notice the twinge of something elsinger, perhaps, or fear. The colonel had once been a protector, a guardian of honor, but his loyalty to Mary made him question everything he thought he stood for. Arbuthnot's resolve was cracking under the weight of his own emotions. His secrets weren't just about his time in the military, they were about a life he had tried to leave behind. His guilt wasn't about what he had done, it was about what he hadn't done. He had failed to protect the Armstrongs, failed to protect the innocence that was lost that day, and now, standing on the precipice of justice, he was willing to take whatever steps necessary to right that wrong, if it meant sacrificing his own soul. He was willing to take whatever steps necessary to right that wrong, if it meant sacrificing his own soul. Next was Princess Dragomirov, an aristocrat draped in jewels and airs of grandeur. But as Poirot pressed her, her icy demeanor began to melt, revealing a woman crushed beneath the weight of her own conscience. Her connection to the Armstrong family had always been masked by her status, but Poirot could see it in the tremor of her hands as she adjusted her pearls, in the subtle quiver in her voice when the topic of Cassetti was raised. The princess had known the Armstrongs intimately, and she had watched as Cassetti's actions destroyed their lives, yet, for reasons unknown, she had remained silent. Her guilt was evident, and the regret in her eyes spoke volumes. The cost of her silence had been too high. She had lived with the shame of knowing what had happened and choosing to do nothing. Now, facing the consequences of her indifference, her emotions were raw rage at herself, at Cassetti, at the entire world for allowing this injustice to persist. But did that rage drive her to murder? Or was there something more? And then there was Antonio Foscarelli, the boisterous salesman, whose loud laugh and exaggerated gestures had always seemed to mask something darker beneath the surface. When Poirot questioned him, Foscarelli's bravado crumbled. His voice wavered as he spoke of Cassetti, and for the first time, Poirot saw the cracks in his carefully constructed persona. Foscarelli had known the Armstrong family, had worked for them, and the anger he felt toward Cassetti was too great to ignore. But the salesman's grudge wasn't just a product of Cassetti's past crimes, it was personal. Poirot pressed him, and Foscarelli's rage began to spill over in a tirade of accusations. His voice trembled as he recounted how his life had been ruined by the events surrounding Daisy's death. His rage wasn't just for justice, it was for the man who had destroyed everything he had built. But was this enough to make him a killer? Or was there more to his connection with the murder that Poirot had yet to uncover? Count and Countess Andrigna remained elusive. Their love was a shield, but Poirot could see it was a fragile one. The Andrignas shared a bond of loyalty that ran deep, yet their evasiveness only added to the sense that they were hiding something far more dangerous. The Countess, though elegant and composed, had eyes that betrayed her every thought. When she spoke of the Armstrong case, her words were measured, carefully chosen, but her lips trembled ever so slightly, as if there was something she was keeping locked away in her heart. Poirot pressed them both, but their responses were guarded, their faces unreadable. It was clear to him now that the Andrignas weren't just witnesses to tragedy, they were participants. But in what way? Had they been accomplices to a greater plan, or was their role more complicated than Poirot could have imagined? The breaking point, the hidden dagger. As Poirot continued his interrogation, a new piece of the puzzle emerged, chilling and unexpected. A hidden dagger was discovered in the cushion of one of the train's plush seats, its blade stained with fresh blood, its hilt engraved with an intricate pattern Poirot recognized. It was the same dagger that had once belonged to a member of the Armstrong family, passed down through generations as a symbol of their noble lineage. The discovery sent a ripple of panic through the room. Poirot's suspicions were confirmed. This murder was not just an act of vengeance, it was deeply personal. The dagger was a symbol of justice, a weapon steeped in history and pain. The question now was, who had it belonged to? And how did it tie into the tangled web of guilt and betrayal that had ensnared the passengers? The attack on Poirot. As Poirot pondered the implications of the dagger, the stakes were raised even further. That night, as he slept, the train seemed to come alive with a new danger. Poirot awoke with a start, his heart racing, to find himself under attack. Someone had tried to kill him, but they were not swift enough. He had narrowly escaped, though the experience left him shaken. The tension aboard the train was at its peak. Someone on board was desperate to stop Poirot from uncovering the truth, willing to kill to protect their secrets. The clock was ticking, and the passengers' emotional defenses were weakening, leaving them vulnerable to the truth that Poirot was determined to uncover. Cliffhanger ending. As Poirot stood before the passengers, his mind reeling from the attempted attack, he spoke with a grim determination. "Monsieur, mesdames," he began, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I now know that the tragedy of Daisy Armstrong runs far deeper than I ever imagined. But the question remains, who is the murderer? And who among you is willing to kill again to protect your secrets?" The silence in the room was deafening. The air was thick with suspicion, fear, and guilt. Poirot's gaze locked with each of them, his sharp eyes unblinking. One of them had tried to silence him, to stop him from uncovering the truth. As the storm howled louder outside, Poirot turned to leave, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. But just before he disappeared from sight, he paused, looked over his shoulder and added, "The truth will come to light, but not without cost." And with that, he vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only questions and the chilling certainty that the game was far from over. The climax. The dining car was eerily quiet as the passengers filed in, their faces drawn with tension, their eyes flickering nervously as they took their seats. The luxurious surroundings seemed to mock the gravity of the moment, their gleaming silverware and polished china serving as a stark contrast to the storm that raged not only outside, but within the hearts of those gathered. Poirot stood at the front of the room, his small frame brimming with an air of quiet authority. His eyes swept over each passenger reverie, one of them a puzzle, a key to unraveling the truth. The snowstorm outside had trapped them in this isolated realm, and Poirot knew that time was running out. This was his moment. The time for theory and conjecture had ended. Now he would reveal the truth, and in doing so, unearth the secrets they had all tried so desperately to bury. The reveal begins. Poirot's voice broke the silence, cool and measured. "Mesdames et messieurs, I have come to two conclusions, two possibilities. 1. A single murderer sneaked aboard the train and committed this crime, hiding amongst you until now. The second possibility, however, is far more complex." The tension in the room intensified, each passenger leaning in slightly, as if instinctively knowing that the answer they sought was hanging by a thread. Poirot paused for effect, allowing the weight of his words to sink in before continuing. Solution 1. The lone killer. Imagine, if you will, that one individual, a killer of unmatched cunning, slipped aboard the train without anyone knowing. This person someone with a heart hardened by Régisseur Samuel Ratchett, or rather Cassetti, as the symbol of a crime that could not go unpunished. This person, alone in their vendetta, attacked, and in a moment of madness, took Cassetti's life. Poirot's eyes swept over the room, pausing on each of the passengers. "But I do not believe this. The evidence is clear. A single killer would not have been so precise. It was not just the manner of death that intrigued me, but the very nature of the wounds themselves. A deep, forceful stab, followed by shallow, hesitant ones. As though the killer at first was unsure. But as the retribution unfolded, they gained the strength to deliver their final blow." He turned, his back to the group, allowing the tension to fill the room like a suffocating fog. No, this was not the act of one man or woman. This was the act of many. This was the act of many. Solution 2. The collective justice. Poirot slowly turned back to face them, his eyes now sharp, piercing. What if? What if every one of you took part in the murder? What if you each delivered a stab as retribution for the crime that had been committed against the Armstrong family? What if Cassetti's actions, the kidnapping and murder of a child, had united you all in your collective rage, your collective grief? The room went still. The sound of the storm outside seemed to grow louder, filling every corner of the space as Poirot's words sank into the very souls of those seated before him. One by one, their faces shifted, shadows of guilt, grief, and fear etched in their expressions. The truth, though hidden beneath layers of deception, was beginning to surface. They had each been a part of something far greater than just the murder of one man. They had been a part of a collective decision, a moment in time where justice had bled into vengeance, character depth, and emotional unraveling. Poirot's voice softened as he turned to face the passengers once more, each person now vulnerable in his gaze. "Mary Debenham, you were the first to act, weren't you? Your pain was too much to bear. The loss of Daisy Armstrong, the betrayal you witnessed. You took the first step, driven by grief that knew no bounds." Mary's eyes flickered, a tear escaping before she could hide it. She had been the steady one, the one who kept her emotions in check, but now the mask had shattered. The years of repression, the years of hiding her broken heart, had led her here. She had participated in Cassetti's death not just for justice, but to silence the ghost of a tragedy that had haunted her every waking moment. Poirot's gaze shifted to Colonel Arbuthnot. "And you, Colonel, ever the protector, you acted out of loyalty to Mary, and to a cause greater than yourself. You too are not free of this. Collective justice." The Colonel's jaw clenched. He had always carried the weight of honor and duty, but today his sense of justice had been bent, twisted by a shared resolve to make the man pay for his sins. "Princess Dragomirov, your pride, your guilt, your ties to the Armstrongs were deeper than anyone knew. Your silence, your inaction, was a betrayal in itself. But you knew, didn't you? You knew that, in the end, this man could never go free." Poirot's voice softened, as though understanding the sorrow that had driven the princess to take part. "You acted to atone for years of regret, didn't you, princess?" Tears welled in the princess's eyes as she nodded slowly. The weight of a lifetime of guilt, of knowing the truth yet doing nothing, had led her to this moment of reckoning. "Antonio Foscarelli, your anger boiled over, didn't it? You were wronged, your life shattered because of Cassetti's actions. You felt helpless, but not anymore. Now, you had the power to make him pay." Foscarelli's face twisted, his chest heaving with the weight of suppressed emotion. For years, he had lived with bitterness, and now he had sought a final, brutal form of justice, one that had come at the cost of his humanity. "Count and Countess Andrigny," Poirot continued, his gaze steady. "You hid behind love, but beneath that, you shared a bond far deeper. A shared need for retribution. You didn't act alone. Both of you together ensured that Cassetti's reign of terror ended with his blood staining your hands." The Countess's lips trembled, and she reached out to clutch her husband's hand. The love they shared had always been a shield, but it had now become the weapon that had severed the life of the man who had caused them so much pain. The Countess's lips trembled, and she reached out to clutch her husband's hand. The love they shared had always been a shield, but it had now become the weapon that had severed the life of the man who had caused them so much pain. The shocking twist. Poirot's voice hardened as he approached the final, devastating conclusion. "Every single one of you took part in the death of Samuel Ratchett. And each of you, in your own way, delivered the justice that had been denied for far too long." The room was silent. The passengers were not just guilt-ridden, they were shattered. Their souls, laid bare before Poirot, stood at the precipice of their own destruction. They had acted out of a desire to correct an unthinkable wrong, but in doing so they had committed an even greater one. Poirot paused for a long moment, allowing the weight of his words to sink in, before adding the final twist that would haunt them all. "But, mesdames et messieurs, there is one more piece of the puzzle. You may have killed Cassetti, but it was not an act of pure justice. It was an act of vengeance, an act that, for each of you, will never be washed clean. The law may never know your names, but your consciences will never be free." Cliffhanger ending. Poirot's eyes narrowed, and for a brief second, a flicker of something darker passed across his features. "I will make my final recommendation to the authorities. But you, each of you, will live with the truth, and the truth is far more dangerous than you know." With that, Poirot turned on his heel and walked toward the door of the dining car. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the silence that followed. But as he reached the door, he stopped, his back still to the passengers. Without looking back, he whispered, "The game is over. Or is it?" The door closed behind him, leaving the passengers to grapple with the terrifying realization that perhaps the real consequences of their actions had only just begun. The emotional resolution. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling like a wounded animal, as the train slowly edged its way through the snow-covered landscape. Inside, the passengers sat in a tense silence, their eyes hollow and their minds heavy with the weight of the truth. The moments that had passed since Poirot's revelation seemed to stretch into eternity. Time itself had become an unyielding force, pressing down upon them, suffocating them with guilt, grief, and a quiet despair that would never be fully shaken off. Poirot sat alone in the dimly lit compartment, his back straight, his hands folded in his lap as he reflected on the terrible decisions that lay ahead. The detective, so often seen as unshakable, was now grappling with a dilemma that tested the very core of his being. His mind raced, The images of the passengers, their tortured faces, their anguished confessions flashing before his eyes. They were not just suspects now. They were victims of their own emotions, caught in the destructive cycle of grief, vengeance, and misplaced justice. The decision. A moment of compassion. Poirot stood abruptly, his quiet contemplation shattered by the pressing reality of the moment. He had made his choice. Slowly, with measured steps, he walked to the door of the compartment, pausing for a moment to gather his thoughts. His heart was heavy, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. But he knew this was the only way. He couldn't bring himself to hand them over to the authorities, not when they had already paid a price so steep, so personal. With a steady hand, Poirot opened the door and stepped into the corridor, his voice firm yet filled with a quiet sorrow. The first solution, the one of a lone killer who snuck aboard this train, is the one I shall present to the authorities. There was a ripple of disbelief among the passengers. Some blinked, others sighed with relief, but the truth had already begun to settle in. They had been given a second chance to walk free from the consequences of their actions. They had avenged the death of Daisy Armstrong, but they had also stolen something from themselves in the process: their peace, their innocence. Poirot's decision was not one of forgiveness but of mercy, a decision to spare them from the full wrath of the law. Bittersweet relief. The tension in the dining car, so suffocating moments before, began to break, replaced by a strange and bittersweet relief. Some passengers exchanged furtive glances, their faces pale and drawn, but they knew they had been given an impossible gift, the gift of reprieve. They would walk away with their lives, but the scars of what they had done would remain forever etched in their hearts. Mary Debenham's hands trembled as she wiped away the tear that had escaped her eye. The stoic governess, the woman who had once seemed so composed, now looked as fragile as glass. Her quiet grief was a silent testament to the weight she would carry with her for the rest of her days. Colonel Arbuthnot, too, sat silently, his expression unreadable. He had been her protector, but who would protect him from the torment of knowing what he had helped to do? His hands clenched, his knuckles white, as he tried to quiet the storm raging within him. Princess Dragomirov, whose regal facade had crumbled long ago, sat still, her eyes closed, as if seeking solace in the deepest recesses of her memories. The guilt that had eaten at her for so long had finally come to a head, and now she was left with only the cold reality of her actions. The years of regret, of wishing for a different path, had led her here, to this moment of release. But it felt hollow. There was no joy in this reprieve, no triumph in justice. Only the crushing weight of a life forever changed. Poirot's reflection. Poirot remained in the corner of the room, watching the scene unfold before him. He had spared them, yes. But as the sound of the train's wheels clattering against the tracks filled the silence, he couldn't shake the feeling that justice had been lost, buried beneath the mire of human emotion. Justice, Poirot murmured to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. What is it truly? Is it the law, or is it the heart? His mind wandered, as it often did, to the deeper questions that haunted him. What made a man or woman capable of such actions? What was the price of vengeance? And most painfully, what was the cost of compassion? He had chosen mercy, yes, but had it been the right choice? The passengers, though spared, would never escape the gnawing emptiness that came with their deeds. Would they live with regret for the rest of their lives, or would they come to rationalize it? Could they even live with themselves, knowing they had played such a pivotal role in taking the life of a man however deserving, no matter how righteous the cause? Poirot's eyes flickered over each of them, seeing not just the criminals, but the broken souls beneath the surface. They had been bound together by fate, by a tragedy that had shaped them all in unimaginable ways. And now, they would go their separate ways, each carrying their own burdens, their own demons. No one would ever know the full truth of what happened aboard the train, and perhaps that was for the best. Perhaps the world did not need to know what had been done in the name of justice. And yet, as Poirot thought of the child, Daisy Armstrong, and the tragedy that had set this all in motion, he couldn't help but feel a pang of something deeper than sorrow. Was this justice? Or was it simply a cycle of endless revenge, one tragedy leading to another. The cliffhanger ending. A life unchanged. The detective's gaze lingered on the passengers one final time. His heart, so accustomed to solving puzzles, now felt as if it were a part of the mystery itself. As the train continued its journey, the world outside blurred into a swirl of white. The path ahead was uncertain, just as the paths of those in the dining car were. Poirot turned toward the door, his face an unreadable mask once again. "I shall present my report," he said quietly, the words hanging heavily in the air. "And I shall leave it to others to decide. But remember this, the greatest mysteries of life are not found in the case at hand, but in the hearts of those involved." With a final glance at the passengers, Poirot stepped into the corridor, leaving the room heavy with the unspoken truth. The door clicked shut behind him, and the silence that followed was deafening. The train moved on, carrying its burden of guilt, its passengers forever changed. The real question, Poirot knew, was not about who had committed the crime, but who they would become after it. Would they ever truly escape the shadow of their actions, or would the ghosts of the past follow them for the rest of their days? As the train disappeared into the white void, one final question lingered in the air. Had Poirot, in choosing mercy, truly solved the case? Or had he, in his compassion, merely set the stage for an even darker chapter in the lives of those on board? And in that moment, Poirot himself could not be sure.